Good morning. I'm Amy Hagenrader-Gooding, Associate Professor of English in the Department of English and Modern Languages. I'm here today with Dr. Nancy Niemi. Those of you might recognize her as the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs, a position she's held since 2019. But we're here to talk to her in a different capacity. She has been an educator for over 30 years at the high school and collegiate level, and also she is a researcher, scholar, and writer. And we're here to talk to her today about her 2017 book, Degrees of Difference: Women, Men, and Higher Education. Dr. Nancy Niemi, thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
We are talking today as part of the Center for Teaching Excellence, Innovations in Teaching and Learning Conference, and we hope you will join us for the conference next week. But before we talk about that, we want to dig in and talk about your book. And I have to say, I enjoyed it so much. It was such a delight. Most people don't say that about a scholarly work.
True.
But not only was the research and data compelling because it challenged some of the things that I thought about gender. Mm-hmm. And many of my students come to feminism and gender thinking we've solved all the problems. Mm-hmm. But before we talk about that, I want to read a passage, and we're going to put the graphic up here today for you as well. But it was just such beautiful writing, and I think it distills for our viewers, those who may not have read the book yet, maybe some of the central tenets that you cover. College was the new arbiter of gender equity, and women finally breached its ivy-covered banks. They believed the credentials would speak for themselves. We believed that old gender stereotypes would diminish, if not disappear altogether. This is the promise whispered on the backs of sheepskin, yet this whisper is tangled in ivy, turned cultural kudzu, a web of realities that render the promise of higher education more than troublesome. Goodness. It's beautiful, but it says so much. And so to begin, I want to talk a little bit about how you start the book. And you tell a really compelling anecdote about your son's graduation. Mm-hmm. And the valedictorian and salutatorian, both women, gave wonderful speeches, but it was the class president, the young man who was the class president who got up to speak, that, would you say, distilled for you the idea for this book? Maybe. Can you tell us a little bit about that anecdote and why that was so important for you?
Certainly, yes. So it was the class president who was my son's friend who got up. He's like 6'2", 6'3" in high school, and he says, well, the valedictorian and salutatorian may be women, but look who's president. And it was like lightning. It really solidified for me that something wasn't right, that here we have two women who are at the crowning achievement of their academic high school time, and yet he's pointing out that I still have the power. And it made it worse in the sense that I really liked TC as his name, and I really liked him. I knew him well, so he wasn't trying. I didn't see him as somebody who was really trying to be nasty about women. He was just stating a fact. And as I write in the book, I scribbled that note on top of the program in this auditorium, and I have literally stuck it in every office I've had because I wanted to remember that this was something very important in the way of my thinking about women and education.
Well, for me, what it pointed to was this idea of these entrenched views that we kind of think are outdated. Like, oh, well, women are in school, so and men are here too, so it's all good, you know? Yeah. But this idea of men or man as breadwinner, woman as good mother, these stereotypes, if you will, that kind of persist. And you talk a little bit about the MRS degree, which when I bring up in class, students are like, what are you talking about? But that idea that women would go to college to meet a mate, and the idea that certain fields of study were gendered. So women would study home economics and boys would be pushed into engineering and business. And although it's the 21st century and we think of those things as, oh, back then, how do you see this education still sort of mirroring that idea of gendered learning.
It's still prevalent, and you're right. My students always thought that wait a minute, this is all done. We've conquered all that. Nobody knows what the MRS degree is. What are you talking about? But if you look at the way who majors in what. Women tend to major in, good Lord, education, nursing, sociology, and men tend to major in engineering, math, not biology. Biology has gotten more feminized now. But then the ways in which women and men use their degrees and also the ways they don't earn degrees. And I talk about that quite a bit, and it's only gotten, in my observation and study, even more prevalent since I published it about men not earning degrees but then getting certificates. So if you see, for example, that the real push for badges, digital certificates,
Right.
they almost exclusively benefit men. And so we watch these changes happen in education that they might look a little different now than they did even 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but they're still there.
Right. And you mentioned, and this was a term I hadn't heard of, the glass escalator.
Yeah.
This many of our viewers are probably familiar with the idea of the glass ceiling, but the glass escalator, this idea that men can just sort of rise through their fields just because and the virtue of being a man. But you also talk about, and we're coming off Teacher Appreciation Week, and the idea of so many women in education, more so than men. And when there is, you talk about the devaluation aspect of a profession, that when a woman is in a particular field, you say the effects of that female dominance in a profession leads to subsequent later wage reductions. So how have you seen this maybe in your own academic career or that of your sister academics? That's
a consequence so much of studying who you are, and there's people make a case in some quarters that all research is somehow rooted in our own struggles, our own identity struggles, and I certainly find that to be true of myself. And several economists really put the research behind, is it that women go into a field and then it gets devalued, or it doesn't get devalued and then women go into it, and they really manage to prove that women go into it. So it's the presence of women that devalues it, not that it's already devalued. So that's important then in how I see things now. That really influences me. I worry about that with higher education leadership from where I sit now. The very first meeting I went to of the provosts that belonged to the system, I looked around and said, are these all women? They weren't all women, but there were many, many more women than men. And I'm wondering if I'm watching that happen at the very highest levels of leadership. And if that's the case, then where is the power going? Because I don't pretend for a minute that somehow women get all the power as well as all of our titles.
Right.
And I see that in various professorial ranks as well. Then they tend to fall very genderedly. You see that, I'm sure. English is almost exclusively women. And engineering and computer science and data analytics are almost exclusively men. And so it still keeps falling out the same way. And then who has the power on campus to do what, and what grants and what money flows where? It's never far from my mind.
And you know, it is an interesting question. What field do you pursue? Do you pursue it because, and so I think that is interesting. You talk about the divide between theory and practice. We believe that education is sort of the great leveler, but does this hold to be true outside of the ivory tower? In the ivory tower, how do you see this as a person who's working in education while also being critical of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think because I still believe that education is the most profound thing one can interact with as a human being, to learn, to teach. I think because I hold it there so strongly, I feel like I must be critical of it, because otherwise we pretend that that it is the great leveler and that it's all okay. And if it's going to be this thing that I believe it is, and that so many of us dedicate our lives to, then we really have to see it for what it is, so we can help make it that way rather than pretend that it's doing something that it's not. It's a hard place to sit, though.
It truly is. And as someone who is a first-generation college student, my father finished 8th grade, my mother finished high school. And when I wanted to go to college, they didn't help me much because they didn't know that language.
Right.
And it's the tools and the idea of power. And I want to come back to that because even though gender is a center part of the book, power is crucial. And you say that, going back to this, you write, quote, "If women have entered the clubhouse, men are no longer going to play in it," talking about how as women enter and earn degrees in larger numbers, the degrees have been devalued for men. And so if higher education is now moving towards a credentialing system for men, what would you say is the new playing field? If they're not coming to the clubhouse, what is the new field?
No, and I spent a lot of time researching that because that's really so prove it part of this. If I've made all this case to be true, then what is happening? So I think that when I was researching this, and now I think I see it more, places where women aren't. So construction fields. Now, the construction fields have been around for a long time, but construction fields, gaming, gig work, Amazon and Google, I think, are creating their own degrees, if you will. They're creating certificates that will have, I think, increasing value in the market as a real credential, if you will, for employment that circumvents colleges. So I think that more men than women certainly are going to those places to create legitimate places where they can be credentialed that don't involve all of this stuff where we have to think about writing and think about sociology and think about the things that are currently associated with a traditional higher education degree.
So maybe perhaps more practical, hands-on skills instead of I don't want to say book smarts, but to some degree.
To some degree, I think to some degree that's true, but also more STEM smarts that don't involve deep, long kinds of learning. So instead of learning all about lab skills in the lab, they might be actually learning the same things but doing it from a different place. So I'm going to learn to code, but I'm going to learn to do it at Google and advance that way. Or I'm going to learn a lab bench science, but I'm going to do it through a drug company and so on. So I think that some of the same skill sets just might happen via a different venue. So it could be some theoretical work still going on. Not everybody loves theoretical work anyway,
Right.
but I think that they're finding it there, but that we're watching those different avenues be created as we speak.
And that's interesting because as a woman and going through high school, if you don't necessarily succeed in a math class or I remember chemistry was so challenging for me, and I had wanted to be a veterinarian, but there are lots of different ways to now get to that place.
Right.
And so it makes me think about what fields of study would women pursue if there are alternative pathways to that. We have alternative pathways for education, experienced, instead of going through the educational program. But I just think it's interesting how it's changing. It's just such a fascinating conversation. But kind of going back to that idea of the certificate and these systems, one of the things you talk about as well is the idea of the military. And you say that in some ways you could say that the military is built on a foundation of masculinity. And so it makes me think about the conversations that are going on now about some of these other systems that are much the same way, like policing. And so do we need to then dismantle or dissect these masculine systems? Are we coming through with the wrecking ball and kind of tearing them down? Or is this something that we can do?
Come through and dismantle them?
Dismantle these masculine systems and make a place for a more equal space for instead of so the military or policing that's largely masculine, and we're seeing some problems with that. Do we need a more feminized space in these systems?
Yes, although people will argue that that's absolutely not what we should be doing. But
Right.
I think you asked, should we be doing this? yes, we should be examining how the police and the military are built on masculine understandings of what's powerful and what one should do. I think it's going to take a very, very long time, though, because the foundation of that, the culture, as you know, is a really strong set of bonds, and the culture of those two organizations are very masculine and deeply rooted in how we understand, at least in American culture, men should behave in these ways. And so changing that is going to take a long time. And yes, we need to question it, but it will be not without a deep and long fight is what I want to say.
And that idea of what does it mean to be a man, what does it mean to be a woman, and what all those things talk about. It makes me, you mentioned Christina Hoff Sommers' War Against Boys, and it makes me think about my own women's studies undergraduate. And I remember reading that and discussing like, well, feminism, but what does that mean for men? Which is not is certainly a legitimate question, but I thought it was kind of interesting that we were having that conversation in the 90s in women's studies courses. But I couldn't help but see that concern. In that book, she talks about the danger of feminized curriculum for boys. Like, what does feminism mean for boys? And there's such polarization with it. I remember my son, we got in an argument once, and I remember so vividly, it's one of my favorite memories of him, standing at the top of the stairs, and he got so mad at me for something, who knows, and he was like, you feminist! Like, it was the worst thing he could say to me. But thinking about these divides, it made me think, and Christina Hoff Sommers' work, it made me think about the different division and the concern that we have about introducing whatever it may mean, feminized curriculum, feminized lessons into education. And it made me think of a parallel between racializing the curriculum. So I was thinking about like the pushback that's coming from the 1619 Project, the legislation about divisive concepts and teaching racism, sexism, and that pushback. Do you think that this push or this concern is largely about maintaining white male supremacy and maintaining control of the narrative, and that the men in power in these larger systems, education, what's taught, how it's written, is largely at play here?
Absolutely. Yes, and I think the parallel between a so-called feminizing curriculum and racializing curriculum is quite legitimate as a parallel. And it's scary to me because when you dissect, for example, supposed feminizing the curriculum, what it really means is you're bringing other voices in. It doesn't mean somehow whatever people want to accuse it of mean, if somehow we're taking out any reference to men or we're calling men something that people would find offensive. We're just bringing in different voices. And if you look at what counts as what's been given as examples, Hoff Sommers was talking about just bringing in different pieces of thinking and literature, even at a third grade level, for example. It's what everybody would want. It wasn't something that was evil. We weren't bringing in Mein Kampf, for example, and so on. And same thing with racial connections. We want to have more voices. It's not about playing a zero-sum game that we're taking everything and throwing it all out and putting something completely different. But if you want to know where power lies, the fact that people are so adamant about it tells you just how strongly people feel about making sure that just this narrative is told in just this way.
And even in small areas, I think about in my own field of English, in my undergraduate education, where we would have major authors, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Shakespeare, and Thoreau, and not to say that that's not important, but for women's studies courses, we were in the bottom of the library with no air conditioning. We didn't get the venue.
Right.
Hide out.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because there is an intersection between who has the power, who has the voice, and gender and economics. So you do talk about the economics of education, and to kind of segue to the business model of education, because a lot has been discussed about that. And you talk about the credentialing system, talking about you say, quote, Americans in general have a greater respect for wealth than they do for education, which made me want to cry. But that is very, I think we can all see that. You mentioned earlier about gig economies and Uber, and that parallel between the education system and maybe the sort of the 21st business century business model of Uber, that on-demand service where the customer's sort of rating it. And I just was wondering, do you see what I'm going to call an Uberization of higher ed coming out of all this as education moves into this business model?
When you used that phrase, it was the very first time I'd heard that, so you might want to coin it.
Okay, copyright right here.
Right here. But yes, and it terrifies me because it's created by, and I encounter it in my work right now, people who call themselves businessmen, and that's the phrase they use. I'm a businessman, so therefore I get to tell you, an educator, exactly how your business model should work. And what I want to say is not what I do say, because what I want to say is some very professional version of, you don't understand my business of education then. Because if you did, you wouldn't be making these proposals about the Uberization of, my word, your word actually, of this model. It is not simply pick one from column A and column B and stack them all up together, famous stackable credentials, and somehow you get this comprehensive piece of understanding. Now, liberal arts education, people have and do criticize that as well, and there's no system that's perfect. But I don't think excellent education, higher education, comes from just picking little bits and pieces. And then we haven't even talked about who gets to teach this, and who is qualified and who has the knowledge, skills, and ability to teach. And since we're part of the Teaching and Learning Conference here, that as a teacher educator, it distresses me greatly that anybody apparently can teach anything, and it doesn't really matter whether or not you're qualified to do so. So yes, I really do worry about the Uberization of education, and the future of what we do and how we do it scares me.
I was just reading an article in the Chronicle about the role of tenure and adjunctification of education, and I love our adjuncts. They do such hard and important work, but just how are we outsourcing who, like you said, who gets to teach? It's something that we definitely need to have conversations about, and not just those who are those business, identifying themselves as business leaders. You also make a parallel between calling education sort of like the secular American religion. You talk about this metaphor of schooling as religion, and we've heard a lot about the myth of meritocracy and the problems with that, pretending education serves as the great equalizer. So if we hold this to be true, and if, what place does education have as we know it, if it's just sort of, I don't want to say hoop jumping, but I remember when I was going up for my candidacy, and I said, well, you have to pass a fluency exam, you have to do this, and I just feel like I'm jumping through hoops. And my professor at the time looked at me and said, well, Amy, that's exactly what you're doing. And so how do we bridge that to be meaningful and the true nature of, I guess, the university, as opposed to just this credentialing system?
That's a hard one because you're right. There are things, absent those hoops, what is a formal education? And so I think that the short answer to that is we have to make those hoops meaningful. If I'm going to make you jump through something, then I better know why I'm doing it. You better know why I'm asking you to do that. And then it has to be something where I can assess out the other side and see that you've done this, and in fact, it means something. It measures as something that's different from when you came in that you can now do, even if it is also a hoop within that. I've thought about that a lot as in my current role as I think about conferring degrees and what it means to say that somebody who comes out of our institution and they can do these things, and how do we support that endeavor so that we as educators can stand tall and say, yes, we've helped you do these things, these hoops, if you will, and you are different and more equal and more accomplished and able to go forward because of that.
And there's something to be said for learning's sake.
Oh, yeah.
I do think that many students have a hard time with that. That sometimes you're learning, even though you don't necessarily it's not necessarily a testable checklist, especially when I know my daughter just took I think it's the NCAP. She's taking those tests for graduation. And so much of their learning is rooted in a test. Like, can they pass? And the stress and anxiety, there's so many different ways of learning, so many different ways of knowing and getting beyond that. I love the fact that you're an educator in this leadership position, because I do think that it impacts the decisions and the way in which you lead. And I think that's so important as we look at the changing face of education. So I know that I'm not the only one that values that.
Good.
You mention Arthur Levine, who was the former, in your book, who was the former president of Columbia University. And he calls, he talks about something called the new majority, which references students who aren't necessarily the traditional students who have families, who have jobs, who need remedial instruction, and have other obligations, maybe not attending full time. How do you see the new majority changing the face of college, changing how instruction is delivered? And since we're part of the Center for Teaching Excellence's Innovations in Teaching and Learning Conference, how do you see how we need to innovate in our instruction?
Well, that's a big question and a very good one. The new majority, if we think about if we're going to categorize them as a block, which we know, they can be, people are not always categorized as to one monolithic clump. But if we're talking about people who are not 18 to 21 years old and they're professional of some capacity, they might have children and they come back to school later, or they want to come back to school later. We assume, and perhaps not correctly, that they want to come back to this similar structure that we have right now. And so that ties into, if not that, what might they want or need education for, and then what are they willing to do in order to get that? And so that, I think, really pulls into the questions of how we, as a particular university at UMES, how do we operate, and who are we, and who are we going to be, and is our population still this population? Or are we still saying there would be fewer 18 to 21-year-olds, but there are still many 18 to 21-year-olds who need and want to be as part of a regular, more or less traditional education? Do we strengthen and make that a different but still similar educational enterprise? I think those are the kinds of questions that we're asking. I also worry a lot about how this model could become increasingly distant from elite education. And so I worry a great deal about having at the very top of the very elite education, and we can all name like 50 institutions across the country whom we put in that bucket, and then for the most part everybody else. And what does that mean, and who goes there? And that's something I lose sleep over.
It makes me think of literary theory. It makes me think of who thinks of literary theory? It makes me think of the reader response theory, the ideal reader and the real reader, and the ideal student and the real student. And maybe we need to stop thinking about this ideal student who comes in with all the books already bought, the material already read, and knowing everything to jump as sort of a launching point, and just changing that. I know that I was so rigid about not accepting late work. And then I said, if you have something, I still have deadlines, but if you have something going on, communicate. Communication is key. If you don't take advantage, but because I have students who are mothers, who have jobs, who work in the evening and can't get to the midnight deadline because they have 10 classes during the day, then they go to their job, but they're working at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And it makes you really think that these are not students who are just here for education. Not that that's not important.
Right.
But they come with a different set of circumstances.
Right.
So let's jump, since we've talked about economics, we've talked about power, we've talked about gender, let's talk a little bit about race. You talk, and I'm going to quote you here from page 79 of your book. You say, the intersections of Black masculine identity and underachievement have gained currency in some empirical literature and popular press, but studies of Black, Hispanic, and Latino men and women in relation to higher education performance are still too few, substituting white men's and women's experiences for all college students. So do you think that this is a place of new possible study? And now, having worked at PWI, primarily white institution, and now an HBCU, and looking around, what areas do you see important and necessary as do we need to delineate, how we delineate, and what we look at?
Yeah, I thought I knew. I thought I knew. I clearly wrote that, and I know now even more that we have not done nearly enough work understanding the way black men, and then which black men, because we know black men is not one monolithic group either. So how do we study people who, and neither are all white people, but so how do we look at identity, particularly racial identity in this country, and how it intersects with higher ed? And we don't nearly enough, and we need to. And we need to think about the questions we're asking about that, because I would love it if we didn't have to study that way, but our culture is absolutely a racialized culture. Race, social class, and gender are the major, perhaps sexual orientation, really drive the way we identify ourselves as master narratives. So until if and when those are not master narratives, we need to look at them in relation to the things, the other structures in the society that matter, and education absolutely directs the way somebody as a black man, an African-American man in this culture versus an African-American woman, and so on. And so we do need to continue to, much more so than we have, in looking at the way their work with higher education intersects and it helps them become whom they want to be, or why they don't attend, and what we need to understand as educators in order to make something better than what it is, and particularly educational enterprises better than what they are.
Possible dissertation topic for our graduate students out there.
Oh, yeah.
Another thing that you mentioned, you talk about Walker Dean, who talks about masculinities and femininities. And you say, you quote him saying, as fictions are linked to fantasies with this idea that all identities and performances and people can construct, sustain, and recreate identities through their interactions within institutions. And essentially, it makes me think of Judith Butler and performing gender. As we're starting to question what this means and gender identity, I guess not starting to, but it's gaining more popular conversation. So as more individuals are choosing gendered or non-gendered identity, will the binarism and the divide be dismantled? Will we need to be having conversations about gender, and will it still be a factor? Is this sort of some utopian idea?
Oh, I'd be interested to see that day. I don't think so. I don't think it's going to dismantle it. I'd be fascinated to watch it happen. But I still think that the gender is such a strong source of our identities, and for some, I think at the moment and for the foreseeable future, I see gender neutral work and gender non-binarism as being considered fringe still. I think it's tremendous that we now can choose neither on a list of gender, male, female, neither. But I think we have a ways to go before it is not an issue. But my question will then still remain: so where is power going, and who holds power? Does it all move to race? Does it move to something completely unknown yet? Because unfortunately, people want power, and they gravitate towards having it. Who has it and who doesn't? So, I'd love to live to see the day when gender is no longer an issue, but I don't think that's going to happen.
It is interesting to see these conversations, and I love seeing it with my own children and in our students and their conversations about it in ways that it seems so much more open than it was for even me in school. So you talk about power, and I guess maybe that's our great big umbrella here. So you talk in your second chapter entitled Power, Patriarchy, and Gender Identity in Higher Education. And you begin that chapter with a quote by Thomas Frank, quote, "All the learning in the world, all the good grades and high test scores don't mean a thing when people have no power." So how do we gain access? If education can't do it or do it enough, what's the solution? You present 10 solutions, and we've got a graphic that we'll put up, a couple of those that you mention. College should be hard. Admit that we're extending high school. Advising should address inequities. We need to speak out about the dynamics of power and privilege, and we need to challenge gender stereotypes. And this is just a list of 10 that you mentioned. So can you expound on some of those, maybe ones that seem, I hate to ask you to put them in a hierarchy, but that seem most important to you since you wrote the book in 2017, and if there's anything that you would add to that list.
Yeah, I looked at that list when I was preparing for today, and I thought, I actually like the list more now than I did when I wrote it.
Well, that's good.
Okay. So it... And the publisher, before we started, we were talking about publishing, and the publisher really said, you got to have a list. I thought, okay, how do I make a list?
Everybody loves a list.
They do. And so at the time it seemed like, oh, really? Talk about a hoop to jump through.
Mm-hmm.
But I did, and so I was pleasantly surprised to see that again and really consider them and go, okay. And so, but now trying to put them in an order, I do we'll start with advising. And from my own seat now, I don't think us as faculty advisors, as professional advisors, I don't think we really understand our own power in terms of helping our students understand. I don't think we talk about gender or race nearly as much as we should. Of course, I'm not in the room with all of those conversations, but I don't see it on a day-to-day basis within our own work here, where people are saying, well, did you think about, yes, you only got a C in that chemistry class, but if you want to be a vet, do you know how many women own in fact, veterinary science now is dominated by women. It is actually a female-friendly, and of course the pay has gone down, but we won't go there. But if you want to be a vet, don't let that C stop you, which actually, from our research, we know that women will stop at the C, and men see a C and go, I passed the course, I'm still going on. So that kind of conversation with our students, repeatedly calling out racial and gender differences, and to help them see that you can, this thing, don't let this thing stop you, or have you considered that? So I think that is one very big source with our students, and then with each other. It's still not okay for me to talk about gender in a lot of ways. I get cast as, oh yeah, that's what you always talk about. So of course you would bring that up.
Right.
When in fact it's a very legitimate thing, that whatever the aspect is that I've seen. So and sometimes I self-censor, which is unfortunate, but you have to watch as a professional. Every conversation should not be about gender, even though I'd like it to be sometimes, or race for that matter. And that gets complicated in my profession, particularly at an HBCU. How much should I claim to speak for African Americans when I am certainly not, and when is that okay and when is that not? I wrestle with that many times a day. And so how does that intersect with education and then with gender as well? So having those conversations, I think that was one of my lists, just having the conversation over and over again, I think is necessary if we don't want to keep putting these pieces in buckets and seeing them as just things, we should think about, but really they don't matter for us on a daily basis. So that would be a couple of things that I would still recommend, if not even more so than I did at the time that I made that list. I don't remember the other things that you articulated, if there are other things you wanted to ask me about that
Well, I
list.
loved that you talked about advising. I know that for a time that we had conversations even here about starting a central advising space. And because so many students who come to higher education don't necessarily might be in the same boat as I was, where they don't know how to navigate all the educational paperwork, or they don't know how to take what classes should be, and you, as an advisor, you might see your students for activation in the fall or in the spring, and then sometimes, honestly, we kind of forget about it until it's time to register. And how much beyond this is the class you should take this to go through your major, but what's going on with you? And what are your next steps? And where are you going with internships? And how have you met a mentor to kind of work through this? And it's so much more. And I really thought that was important. You talked about new feminist movements, resisting writing stories that glorify men with no formal education. I loved that.
Oh, yeah. As late as last night, Saturday Night Live, Elon Musk was the host. I'm thinking, oh, please.
I know. Absolutely. You talked about admitting that we're extending high school and that college should be hard. I don't know that all of our students would agree with that.
No, they would not.
So tell me what you mean by that, and tell me how you think that should be part of our prioritization here and changing things?
Well, it is. I think that we saw, particularly over the last year, the role that caretaking plays in our schools and K-12 schools. I see no shame in admitting that K-12 schools, particularly at the younger grades, it is in fact childcare, and as well as profound education, and that one should be trained at that. And I think that to say at 18, if it were, the world was different when we set up these systems 100 years ago in America and 75 years. So the world is now different again. And I think there's more to be learned and more to be done. So we think about K-21 or P-21 schooling. And so if it's the case that we now acknowledge that, yes, college is actually another step that, if not required, is pretty close to being required if you want to go forward in a career that's more than, in a job even, in not even so much as a career, that you really need these skills and dispositions, and particularly because of the inequities in our school systems, our public school systems. That's an entirely different and extended conversations, but so many students come simply not prepared to do the kinds of work that we want them to be able to do. And so acknowledging, yes, you've got some more work ahead of you, let's get to it, and this is a part of being an educated person. Were I queen of the universe, I'd have a public service requirement for a couple of years, so you could really see what the world looks like, and an education certainly could be part of that as well. So I think, and college should be hard. I don't want it to be just a set of hoops. I want you to think. So let's think less about only if you get A's are you somehow learned, and more about, I really want you to read 1619 Project with me, and I want to think hard about that. Critical thinking is, I think, one of the key ways in which we become deeply, thoughtfully human. And I want to engage with that with our students. I want all of us to engage with that. And so maybe it shouldn't be hard in terms of your deadline will be at 12 and not at 12:01, but hard as in I want you to think.
And the grade obsession, I think, is something that's really interesting too. That's another topic. But I always tell my students that I wish that I could do something like Evergreen College, where they don't do the grades, but they do the written evaluation.
Yes.
Because I just think they get so fixated on the grades when the question should be, but did you learn something?
Exactly.
Going back to that chemistry class I got a C in, that I worked so hard, and I learned a lot about myself in terms of discipline and what I could do if I put my mind to it.
Yeah.
I didn't pursue that career, but I was still very proud of that.
Yeah.
And I don't think necessarily a C necessarily indicates learning, and I think that's important.
Yeah.
So since we're talking about as part of the Center for Teaching Excellence's Innovations in Teaching and Learning Conference, what do you think that teachers and educators and researchers can do to create authentic gender equity and to infuse these lessons in their curriculum, in their research, in their work?
How long do you have? It's so. What I want to say is it's so easy. It's easy for me. It's what I think about all the time. But there are so many small steps. So let's take the classroom first. And there's lots published on this, and Cynthia and I, as part of the Center for Teaching Excellence, talk about this a lot. You can pay attention to who you call on in class. You can pay attention to the pronouns that you use. You can pay attention to the examples that you use, so that a business leader is not always male. So the small and daily, multiple times a day decisions that you make within a classroom, and then as part of your curriculum. Whom do you have as representative? Whom do you read? Whom do you put on the screen?
Right.
And that it seems so simple, but the number of professors I've worked with over the years who that is a revelation that we can put women on there, we can put somebody who is black on there, and somebody who's Hispanic, and that on the one hand, sure, it's a small act. But it's a meaningful one when all the rest of our time we've only been putting white men up in our curricula, or by default using he when everybody knows we mean she. Well, no, that language matters. So that is a start. It's one starting place, and then looking at how we as colleagues talk about our work with each other. Who gets grants? How do we help people get grants? Who gets scholarship? Who gets time off? Whom should we be encouraging to take time for a sabbatical? How and not be afraid to say, well, all right, let's take a look. How many men? How many women? who's chair, who's a committee head, whom do we ask to do the work of taking notes of. There's so many different business processes where we assume that women will take the minutes, that women will take care. There's a whole raft, I want to say, a whole segment of caretaking jobs in our university and every university where they are performed exclusively or almost exclusively by women, and we don't even see it.
I call it the curse of competency.
Yes. Oh, there's that. Yes. So how do we pay attention to that, and how do we do it differently? All of our administrative assistants are women.
Right.
Every single one of them across the university.
Wow.
What do we do about why? And why are we not talking about that? And so on. So I think so from small gestures that we can control just by ourselves to very big ones that take systemic work, all and everything in between. I think if we're not asking the questions, if we're not paying attention to the ways in which gender and at our university race absolutely as well, work to infuse themselves or not infuse themselves in our work, then we need to be paying attention all the time.
And I think that work is ongoing.
Yes.
And it makes me think of, even you talked about language. I'm so guilty of coming into a classroom or starting an email, "Hey guys," and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, wait a minute!" But it's just.
We're part of our own culture.
Yes.
Yes.
And questioning that, you talked about the idea of representation and putting up, and representation is just so important. And you talk a little bit about, in your book, you mentioned Sheryl Sandberg's, and I'm sure many of our viewers are familiar with her Lean In work. Mm-hmm. And you talked about Lip's study that, quote, women's scarcity in top positions is their inability to imagine powerful roles for their future selves while still in college. And it made me think about what my students talk. I've noticed a increase in their conversation about manifestation. Like, dream it, believe it, make it happen. But there's also this sense about, as you mentioned, this dearth of leadership roles for women. Mm-hmm. And so how can leaders and teachers help students with this? And how is representation a crucial role in overcoming this? If you don't see women in leadership positions beyond just like putting up a vision board and trying to imagine and believe that you're going to get there, because that's important. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But how do we get there? How do we get our students there?
I think we don't let up. Mm-hmm. I think we all the time say, yes, you don't see many women there. You don't see many African Americans there. You don't see many African American women, et cetera, be there. And you might have to be the first over and over and over again. But I think we don't get to say that once and call it done. We just can't. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, the manifestation is one wonderful piece of that. But it's so not enough. We've got just not taking no ever for an answer. I was talking about this the other day with someone who said that he knew a consultant who was a very high-powered business consultant who knew she would walk into the room and all the time all she would see is white men. She knew every single time she would go in. And she said, I had to understand that I just had to dismiss that from my mind and go in and do my job. Because if I started thinking about what I knew they were thinking, which was, how are you competent to do this job? She said, I would just write myself right out of the whole job. So I think talking about that process with our students, and that's we all succumb to it, we all think about it, and it's okay, because that doesn't mean we still can't do it. Right. But I just think we can't let up ever.
It makes me think of this. It was one of those things that circulated around social media, and it was like, how old were you the first time you had an African American teacher? But how old were you the first time you had you encountered a female in a leadership position? And how many positions? You can play that game,
right? And
you start thinking about it in a way that maybe you hadn't thought about before, because you just assume, well, this is the way it is. And as you're saying, you can say it once, but you can't let up. You got to. Right. It's super important. I think that's something to remember. So how do you see these trends occurring at institutions that you've attended, that where you've worked? And how do you see any new trends in this field that are happening at PWIs versus HBCUs? Do you see a difference in the approach of gender and power between those two institutions?
That's an interesting question. there are more similarities than there are differences. And I have attended and worked at a wide range of institutions. People who look at my CV go, "Oh, you have an interesting CV," which is code for "I don't know what to do with that," because I've been in so many different, mostly PWIs, but different, very different kinds. And so, but the through line in them is that gender is not discussed appreciably differently at any of them, and so that makes me go, why is that, and how powerful is gender if it's still under the radar at all of these very different kind of institutions? Like race is different, though. I mean, we're at an HBCU, and it is wonderful. Although it's not race, I find, at least in my experience, which in might part be because of my role at the moment, but we do not discuss race here nearly as much as I think we should, in terms of how we do our work and how we make change. And I'm working hard to try and change that. Although again, given my position, sometimes it's really hard, and I just have to always walk through that and understand that it will be hard. But PWIs, and again, I've been at some very different ones. People in PWIs, and I realize I'm generalizing, think very differently about race and what they should do with race and gender than folks in an HBCU in general, again. And that's not surprising, but fascinating and disappointing. And the lack of gender discussion is as interesting as it is disappointing as well across the institutions that I've worked and attended.
Okay. All right.
So
that's interesting that there's more similarities. So it's work in both sets. That's important. So before we go, I'd like to talk about your latest work, which is the Wiley Handbook of Gender Equity in Higher Education, and it's a collection of essays you edited and published last year. And you contributed a chapter entitled "Institutions of Higher Education as Gendered Workplaces." How do you see this chapter as a natural outgrowth of Degrees of Difference? And where does it move beyond the work that you did in that work?
Oh, I'm glad you noticed that, because that's exactly the kernel that's developing here. That's where that came from. And I have to say that work, which my co-editor had a co-editor, Marcus Weaver Hightower, who I cold called to ask me to edit that book about a decade ago. So that I love to tell that story because he had no reason that he had to say yes. He also researches gender. He usually does it from a male point of view. But so we made a good team. But that chapter in particular was about when we talk about gender equity in higher education, we talk about it, we assume faculty and higher level administrators, so essentially deans and up usually. Right. And so where's everybody else? And so I really wanted to talk about in that chapter about gender equity across all of the places that happen, that exist in higher education. So housekeepers and administrative assistants and lunch, people who serve in lunch and meals. So those are largely women, but it's very gendered. Groundskeepers tend to be male. People who work in food service tend to be women, and so on. So how does that play into our work of equity in higher education? For the most part, we ignore it.
It's just the way it's been. It's the way it's going to be.
Yeah, and the assumption that higher ed equity and gender means faculty usually, or female presidents of higher ed, to me does a great disservice. I went to the University of Rochester for 2 of my degrees, and the only female president is the current one. And I was reading, being the proud alum that I am, I was reading her address to the U of R when she came, and she talked about the very women I was writing about in that chapter. And they interviewed a couple of women afterwards, and they said, nobody has ever talked about us. She acknowledged that we do work, and I just thought, yes, this is what I'm talking about. And so I think that's leading into where I would like to start researching next. First, to put documentation around the fact that when we talk about equity in higher education, we are talking about a great many more people than just faculty and higher level leaders. But what does that mean?
Right.
And also you see it in writing labs, for example. And in your own department, we're all women and are almost all women, and the adjuncts are almost all women. And so who's doing that work? And how grossly are they getting underpaid? And who's even being paid attention to? And so that's really, I think, where I'm headed next. I just have to think about how how to research and how to conceptualize it. But I don't know who said if you can't. Oh, I think it's attributed to Bette Midler, but I don't know if it's right that if you can't be a good example, be a horrible warning. And so if this thing I love so much, if we can't make it the shining beacon that I need it and want it to be, then at least I need to help expose where we still have a lot of work to do too.
Okay. So in spite of everything, all the things we've talked about, problems and issues with power and economics, issues with gender, race, do you still believe in the university as an ideal, as a change agent?
Absolutely. And that's, as we started this conversation, it might be a hard idea to hold in both places in my head, but I absolutely do. It is the place where we collectively think that we want to learn something and we want to talk about it and we want to give knowledge and all of the knowledge and all the ways we conceive of it and learn of it and all the ways we don't know and need to learn about it. This is our work. This is the space that we say we want to do it, and we want to work with others, students and colleagues and people around in the community. Where else do you get to do that? That's our job, and the place where if we do it right, even a little bit of the time, we have the possibility of changing even just one person's thinking. I don't know about you, but when I get that email or that note from a student or a colleague and says, you helped me do something different, and your life is forever changed. Theirs, yours, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Yes, it's still
Absolutely.
an ideal.
I think the saddest scene for me is in The Time Machine, where he goes and he looks at the books when he's in the future and they're just dust. They just crumble.
Yeah.
And I just think, not that books are the only way of learning, but just education is... I think we're both here, and I think our viewers are here as part of the Center for Teaching Excellence because they do believe in education.
That's
and
right.
So we just have to continue to do the work.
Yeah.
Dr. Nancy Niemi, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome.
We hope that you will attend the Center for Teaching Excellence's Innovations in Teaching and Learning Conference, and we hope that you'll join us again as we continue to have these conversations about education and learning. I'm Amy Hagenrader Gooding. Thank you for joining us.